Well, here we are with the last set of notes for this module. And what we are going to be doing is talking about a specific application of a bunch of the things that we have discussed over the last two modules or 2 weeks. And this is going to all come together in our characterization of what's known as the loanable funds market. So what I want to do is to think about, first of all, just some overview, but then um, depict the loanable funds market, think about what the definition of it is and how we describe it, and then illustrate it. And then think about, because it's demand and supply, we're just compelled to do this, shift the demand and supply curves around and talk about some basic principles, and then illustrate specifically some of the trade-offs involved in especially fiscal policy. So what I'd like to do is to suggest to you kind of the context in which we're operating here. So in our previous discussion, we took the real interest rate as being given. So we took it as given when we were talking about compounding and discounting problems. We said, suppose the interest rate is such and so, how much would an amount of money be worth 5 years from now, or if you were to receive it in the future? Similarly, when we looked at the relationship between the real interest rate and consumption, or the real interest rate and personal savings, or in the last set of lecture notes, the real interest rate and net capital inflows or net exports, we were always saying, suppose the real interest rate is such, what happens? So our goal right now is to be thinking about the determinants of the real interest rate. And what I want to suggest to you is that this is interesting for several reasons, not limited to these, but here are some biggies. So, one of the things that we're going to see in our characterization of the loanable funds market is that we're going to be describing the factors that influence the level of investment. And as I suggested, I don't know, maybe two sets of notes ago, thinking about the level of investment and what drives it is important, because as investment changes, then the country's physical capital stock changes, and that can influence our standards of living. So we'll talk about this again a little bit later in this set of notes. Secondly, as we will see, the interaction of demand and supply in the loanable funds market yields an equilibrium interest rate that we're going to call the neutral real interest rate. And this is important for one, because it's telling us what would happen in a macroeconomy in terms of interest rates and investment if we had full employment. So that alone is an interesting question. But additionally, we think about this neutral real interest rate as a component of the factors that go into the way in which the Fed in the United States and other central banks around the world conduct monetary policy. So we'll see this very starkly in our discussion in chapter 22. And then the third reason I think of as being important to talk about this is that this gives us yet another look at fiscal policy. So we kind of alluded to this in some previous notes. In addition to the idea that fiscal policy choices can influence the level of investment, we can also just think about what these trade-offs are. So importantly, not from a party line, you know, sort of rabid dogmatic point of view, but from a principled perspective, somebody might advocate certain fiscal policy choices because they would assert correctly, all other things equal, that this would stimulate investment and in turn long run economic growth. And what I think is useful to think about is the sense in which that's true, and then also the trade-offs. So we'll have an opportunity to begin to think about that in at the very end of these notes. So what we're going to be doing is describing, as I said, a loanable funds market. So this is an example of a capital market. So in the previous set of notes, we talked about there being capital markets and money markets, but this is a financial market. So a type of financial market. which is itself a component of the financial system. So when we're talking about loanable funds and we're talking about trading capital assets, these are longer term assets, not money type assets. And the idea here would be that it's linked to ultimately, say, firms acquiring funds to undertake gross private domestic investment. So in this market for loanable funds, the savers supply the funds, the investors are the ones who are on the demand side. So by investors in this context, again, what we mean is this in the very specific language of economics. So we mean gross private domestic investment, residential investment, non-residential investment, and inventory investment. So as we saw with our example toward the end of the previous set of notes, we want to abstract from short-run business cycle influences. And so we're going to consider all of our analysis from the perspective of the long run. And in the long run, what we are presuming is that we have potential. The level of gross domestic product is the potential level of gross domestic product. And so as well, we have full employment in the macroeconomy. And so we're saying, what if the economy were able to achieve full employment? What would be interest rates, investment spending, consumption, all that kind of stuff? And in this context, if we were going to think about the movement of interest rates, obviously there's a myriad of interest rates in the macroeconomy. This one is one that we would think of as evolving slowly and one that balances these sort of more longer run things in the macroeconomy, the overall level of savings in the economy, and the overall level of investment in the economy. And this will be in contrast to interest rate changes that we see, particularly in Chapter 22, that happen in short term money markets. Perhaps influenced by central bank actions. So we will have kind of two notions of interest rates by the time we're done with this course, one that evolves in the long run, and then short run interest rates that perhaps bounce around a little bit more. So in terms of thinking about the characterization of the loanable funds market, we're going to, again, take a tack that was similar to in the previous set of notes, and we're going to start with this basic equilibrium condition that we have, which is that the amount of spending in the economy, C plus I plus G plus NX, is the amount of income or the amount of production of real goods and services. So Y is gross domestic product. And in this particular case, what we're going to do is express this with investment on the left-hand side of the equation and all the other variables on the right-hand side of the equation. And as we saw in the previous set of notes, we're going to do our little trick here of subtracting and adding taxes to get the expressions that we see in the parentheses, and then rewrite in the way that we talked about previously. So again, this is the level of personal savings. This is the level of government savings. So again, if revenues are bigger than spending on the part of the government, we would say, right, so if T is bigger than G, then we have a surplus. Government has a surplus, and S by the government is greater than 0. And if T is less than G, then we would see deficits, and savings by the government is less than 0, and the government would be a net borrower or a debtor, like we have now. And then we have net exports. So we can rewrite this to reflect again that the negative of net exports is net capital inflows, and we can go one more step along the lines of what we talked about in the previous set of notes. So what you can see is that a lot of what we're doing in this set of notes is going to be putting together stuff. So we saw that the negative of net exports is net capital inflows, and we can interpret net capital inflows as net savings coming from the rest of the world into the domestic economy. So again, what is this? This is net capital inflows, or on net savings by the rest of the world or from the rest of the world in the domestic economy. So rewriting this equation again, what we can do is make a couple of comments. So comment number one is that the level of investment that an economy can undertake is strictly determined by the amount of savings that an economy can generate. And this is why we see so much talk about budget deficits, which are negative savings, or what can we do to stimulate private sector savings? And we'll take this up at the end of the set of notes. The amount of savings that an economy can generate will be the pool of funds that is available for gross private domestic investment. And that's it. And so an economy's investment can only grow to the extent that the stock of savings grows as well. When we model this in the loanable funds market in just a second, we're going to see that we characterize investment as the demand for savings or the demand for loanable funds. And the supply of savings or the supply of loanable funds in this market is the savings by households, the government, and the rest of the world. And then the price in this loanable funds market is the real interest rate. So this is the thing that's going to balance the demand and supply of loanable funds. So here's our picture. We're going to put the quantity of loanable funds on the horizontal axis, and we can also interpret this as the quantity of savings and investment that the macroeconomy does. The demand for savings is savings that, say, firms want in order, so firms are going to borrow in order to undertake investment expenditures. And the supply of savings is coming from the private sector, households, the government sector, and the net of what's happening on the in international transactions. So we can think about the sum of personal and government expenditures as national or domestic savings. So this is a little bit confusing because it looks like a minus sign. So I mean, maybe what I should have done is we can think about national savings as being synonymous with domestic savings. We can see that the interaction of the demand and the supply determine an equilibrium quantity of funds that are borrowed and lent. So the supply of savings is coming about by lenders or savers, and the demand for savings is done by entities in the economy. We can think about this as firms, especially, that are borrowing. And this quantity of loanable funds is at the same time the quantity of funds that are traded. We can think about this as the equilibrium level of savings, but importantly, the equilibrium quantity of investment that the economy is undertaking. And then we have the equilibrium price in this market. And the equilibrium price in this market is what's known as the neutral real interest rate. So we call it R star, and even colloquially, I'm going to link an article or two into Canvas. Might be over the weekend, but I'm definitely going to do it. Where you'll see that policymakers just toss this around. You know, what is R star? What is what they mean by this is literally what we're talking about, which is kind of cool. We're doing, Fed level analysis here. So, what is this neutral real interest rate? It's the interest rate that would prevail when the economy is experiencing full employment, or equivalently, when the level of gross domestic product is at its potential level. So, if kind of harking back to the beginning of the semester, we worried ourselves over why is the demand curve downward sloping and why is the supply curve upward sloping. Happily, we've done all of that, but in my annoying fashion, I want to remind you of where we've done this and what our conclusions were. So, if we are going to talk about the slopes of these curves, so the slope is saying how does, so if R goes up, what happens to the quantity supplied or the quantity demanded? So that's what we're talking about. And so the upward slope of the supply curve of savings. Well, we've done all this. We've done almost all of it. So national savings is going to be a reflection of personal savings. We talked about this in the consumption notes. So you go back to chapter 13, and this was literally the last notes that we had before this set, um, where we talked about the positive relationship between the quantity of net capital inflows and the domestic real interest rate relative to abroad. And the only other piece that we have in here as a component of national savings is, or domestic savings, is savings by the government. So savings by the government, again, is T minus G. It is possible that higher real interest rates could reduce government expenditures. The story that's provided in the textbook is out of a certain level of tax revenue, the income that the government collects, if interest rates are higher, then interest payments that the government has to make are higher. And so that could reduce the amount of spending that happens. As a practical matter, we don't see a whole lot of empirical evidence, at least for the United States, that there's a strong relationship between real interest rates and spending. And so we tend to think more about savings by the government as being sort of independent of the real interest rate. But in chapter 18, you'll see a graph that shows, say, higher real interest rates discourage the quantity of government expenditures and vice versa. And I'll revisit this story in that context. But if there is an effect, it's not particularly strong. For the downward slope of the demand curve, we did this. This was our discussion about the rational rule for investors. Higher real interest rates mean there are fewer projects that we would say yes to, according to this rational rule. For the shifters, we've done all this too. If you go back to, again, the chapter 13 notes, the things that affect consumption also affect savings. So we talked about what those shifters of the consumption relationship are, and they're similar to the ones that would affect savings because, again, out of a dollar of disposable income, you're either going to consume or you're going to save it. We talked about this again in the immediately preceding set of notes that the supply, or excuse me, net capital inflows are going to rise in a domestic economy when there's a reduction in the relative risk of domestic assets, when there are happier thoughts about the domestic economy, and potentially according to some other variables that we might specify. And the only thing that we haven't talked about deeply is government savings. And again, we note that government savings is equal to the tax revenue, the income that the government collects, minus the outlays that the government makes, government spending. And so fiscal policy drives these things. So if there are higher taxes, or lower government spending, or both, then there's going to be, other things equal, a higher level of savings by the government. And the opposite would be true for reductions in savings by the government. For the demand curve, we talked about demand shifters in our earlier discussion about investment. So this is just a repeat of the slide that we had. So we talked about the rational rule for investment, and we said that we can think about the things that shift the demand for investment to the extent that they affect either revenue or depreciation or costs of the project. So these were the things that we had in our previous notes, and you can go back and look at that, follow up with me or a TA as needed. So what I want to do is to consider how changes in the supply or the demand of loanable funds would be expected to change the equilibrium of neutral real interest rate, especially, but also the quantity of investment in some instances, depending upon our example. So in this first example, we're going to consider three. In our first example, let's suppose that there's political strife overseas that make foreign savers look for a safe haven. So the way to interpret this, of course, would be that the domestic economy, let's suppose the US is the domestic economy. So this picture is for the US. It's the domestic economy, and therefore the domestic economy looks relatively safer, less risky. What would happen? Well, what we would expect is that other things equal, that would increase the demand for the US's financial assets. And so we would expect to see higher net capital inflows as a result. So this rightward shift in the supply curve is due to the increase in capital inflows, say, to the US because of political strife overseas. And what would be the consequence of that? Well, again, it's the same kind of thing that we had at the beginning of the semester. We would note that the initial equilibrium interest rate can no longer be the equilibrium interest rate because the quantity supplied of loanable funds is bigger than the quantity demanded of loanable funds at this initial interest rate. And so there'd be downward pressure on the interest rate. And the interest rate would ultimately fall, to this one R1. And we would expect, not surprisingly, a higher equilibrium quantity of savings and investment, a higher equilibrium quantity of loanable funds transacted. So political strife overseas would lead to a lower equilibrium or neutral real interest rate and a higher quantity of investment in the domestic economy. Our second example is one that central banks all over in many places in the world, but definitely in the United States, are wrestling with, and it's this phenomenon that's known as secular stagnation. So, what are the underpinnings of that? There are several long-term trends that are buffeting an economy like the United States is. So one of these is that we have slower population growth, fewer new workers coming into employment, and so that means that less investment is required to equip them. So there's your ticket there. Also, we see a tilt away from traditional manufacturing and towards more tech type firms, and they just don't use as much physical capital. And so, as a result, again, there would be less investment required. And then capital equipment itself has, over the last several decades, become cheaper, with the result that firms need to allocate literally a smaller pool of funds to meet their investment expenditure needs, certainly with respect to these kinds of equipment. So we have all three of these things working together to do what? Well, obviously, to reduce the demand for investment. So if the demand for investment falls, say, from this original one to D1, again, what we can observe is that that's going to correspond to a lower level of investment overall. So initially our level of investment in the macroeconomy was I0. It's going to fall to I1, and we see a lower neutral real interest rate in the macroeconomy. This aspect here is something that policymakers are, especially the Fed, is wrestling with, because again, if we have lower investment and lower stock of capital, the question is, are we going to see growth in the macroeconomy coming from other sources? And hopefully at the end of the semester, we'll have a little bit of time to address that. So what do we in fact observe? Consistent with what we have in our picture here, we see that over the last 20 years or so, there has been a decline in the neutral real interest rate. And again, this decline in the estimate of the neutral real interest rate by almost 2 percentage points is what is referred to colloquially as secular stagnation. And again, when I get my act together, hopefully in the next day or so, if you're interested, you could refer to an article or two that I'll post within Canvas. And then finally, what I want to talk about is fiscal policy. So, for me, what isn't, I mean, it's slightly interesting in economics is curve shifting. What's more interesting is talking about policy and how changes in micro and macro policies affect the markets and variables that we're considering. So let's consider fiscal policy. So we've defined fiscal policy earlier in the semester, but it's always good to do so again. So fiscal policy refers to discretionary changes in government expenditures or taxes in the macroeconomy. And so when we refer to expansionary fiscal policy, we're referring to situations in which either government expenditures rise or taxes fall. And why is this referred to as expansionary? This adjective is going to come into play when we talk about the macroeconomy in the short run. What we'll argue is that more government spending or lower levels of taxes will have an expansionary impact on gross domestic product, and by definition reduce the output gap. So again, here it's harder to see that expansionary notion because we're holding income fixed at the potential level, but it'll be a little bit clearer later. And contractionary fiscal policy, the adjective is referring to the short run impact on the level of gross domestic product and the output gap. So contractionary fiscal policy is implemented by a reduction in government expenditures or an increase in taxes or both. So what I want to consider is an increase in government expenditures, so something that we would label as expansionary fiscal policy that induces an opening of the budget deficit. So we're not balancing that by higher taxes. So therefore, the level of government savings is going to fall. So right, taxes aren't changing by assumption here, and government expenditures are getting bigger. So this whole thing is going to go down. Or in other words, if there is a budget deficit, the budget deficit gets bigger, and if there's a surplus, the surplus gets smaller. So what I'm going to do before we leap into the graphical analysis of this is to discuss this in words and then with a fairly silly example and then go to the graph. So in words, when people are critical of implementing expansionary fiscal policy, like now, some of it is tribalism, but there are some people in Congress in the US Congress, who are arguing against having as big a fiscal expansion to deal with the consequences of COVID-19 as say Senator Schumer and Representative Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi would like. Some people are arguing against that because it will take an already just massively larger budget deficit than we've seen in recent history and make it even bigger. And their criticism of this is that expansionary fiscal policy can lead to this phenomenon known as crowding out. And it is incontrovertible that if we were at full employment, then yes, crowding out will occur in the very narrow sense in which we're going to think about it. So, well, I'll give some qualifications to this as we go through these notes, and then the other thing to consider is that in present day terms, we are not at full employment. So there could be some argument for using expansionary fiscal policy and not having it lead to crowding out. But what do we mean by crowding out? What we mean by this is that if we increase government expenditures, then there is going to, or by extension, reduce, public sector savings. Then there has to be a reduction or a crowding out of some other component of GDP or some other component of the private sector of the economy. So crowding out refers specifically to the reduction in private sector spending. And as we'll see in our picture, in our graph, it'll be via higher real interest rates that occurs as a result of more expansionary fiscal policy. And we can see this very clearly in our expression that we had before. So suppose it's the case that government expenditures rise and therefore savings by the government goes down, right? So if this goes down, we have three other variables that can flex to maintain this equation. So one is that we could see net savings from the rest of the world rising, or in other words, net exports gets crowded out. So if we have foreign sector savings rise, commensurate with the decrease in government sector savings, then that is the same thing as saying net capital inflows go up, or that net exports go down, or that net exports are crowded out. Alternatively, we could focus on another thing that could flex, and that's the level of personal savings. So if government savings goes down, personal savings could rise. So what would be the story here? We see budget deficits rise and we say, oh, crud, down the road, my tax burden's going to go up. And so because I need to pay off, we need to pay off these deficits. And as a result, we're going to save more. So what might happen then if personal savings is rising, then it is necessarily the case out of a given level of income, and we're not changing income, right? We're assuming that income and taxes are fixed, that consumption has to fall or consumption gets crowded out. And then the third option here is that gross private domestic investment gets crowded out. And so that would mean that the decrease in government expenditures would be matched by a decrease in gross private domestic investment. So what I want to do, if I can make my little screen appear, is draw you a silly picture that helps bring this into focus, and then try to, in that context, explain what's going on. So this is one of these times, like many, where it would be so lovely to be in person, because I love to draw this picture and say, what is this? And so I don't hear the hue and cry from the crowd. Sometimes the answer is, it's the sun. I'm like, no. And eventually what somebody will come up with is, it's a pie. So there's my pie, and this is my fluted crust. And it's not only just a pie, it's a potentially great darned pie. Get it? It's potential GDP. I can hear the laughter already. This pie is going to be split, for the moment, among 4 friends. Right, so who gets a big piece of it? Carol. Perhaps you see where I'm going with this. Who gets another piece of this? Ivan. Who gets another piece of this? George. Who gets another piece of this? This is where I always get stumped. So it's Nadia Xavier. I'm a riot, right? So my potentially great darn pie, potential GDP, is split between Carol and Yvonne and George and Nadia Xavier. And so suppose George says, pie, I love pie, and he takes a bigger piece. So George goes like that with this pie. Well, obviously, something has to give. Either Carol gets a smaller piece, Ivan gets a smaller piece, or Nadia Xavier gets a smaller piece, or all of them do. So it doesn't mean that any one of these people has to take the hit unilaterally, but somehow there has to be a crowding out. And that's because, again, at this point, we're talking about there being a fixed pie. And if we have a fixed pie and one person eats more of it, then there is necessarily less for other people. Now, this is something that we're going to come to by way of qualifications in a moment. How do we see this in a picture? Well, again, what do we observe? Let me go back here. We've got our equilibrium here, and we have an increase in government expenditures. That's going to decrease savings by the government. And the result of that would be that we have a lower supply of savings in the market. And of course, we would see that the economy is going to re-equilibrate at this higher neutral real interest rate. Interest rates are going to rise. And importantly, we can say the level of savings and investment are going to go down. And we can see crowding out here if we squint real hard and think about what an adjustment is in a market in response to a shift, right? So how do we do this? We notice that after the supply curve shifts to the left, this is at R0, this is the quantity supplied of loanable funds, and this is the quantity demanded of loanable funds. And so we can see that at R0 star, after the decrease in the supply of savings, there is a shortage of loanable funds. And just as we saw with the stuff at the beginning of the semester, which is why we did it, that shortage is going to put upward pressure on the price. And as the price goes up, in this case, that's the real interest rate, we're going to have a movement along the supply curve and along the demand curve. So along the supply curve, what's happening? What is this? This increase in quantity supplied is going to be an adjustment in the quantity supplied here and here. So if we see an increase in the quantity supplied by, say, households of savings, they can only can only increase their quantity supplied of savings by doing less consumption. And if we have an increase in the quantity supplied of net capital inflows, what is that? Well, that's because there is a decline in net exports. This is the crowding out of C and net exports. On the demand side, we have this adjustment along the demand curve, right? And that is our decline in investment expenditures. So this, right, is the crowding out of I. And so this is where we can see crowding out in a graph, but from a conceptual point of view, if it helps, you can just think about my great darn pie example. Now, why do we care about this? We care about this problem of crowding out because we had the observation that the capital stock next period, the physical amount of stuff that we have available to produce goods and services in the future with, is dependent upon the amount of investment that happens in current times. And so if it is the case that budget deficits crowd out investment expenditures, so it could be that it crowds out consumption, could be that it crowds out trade or that net exports fall. But if budget deficits crowd out investment expenditures, then this is going to result in slower growth in the capital stock and slower improvements in our long run standards of living, as we'll see again, hopefully at the end of the semester. Now, I think at this point it is important to say that this is not me saying we should never run budget deficits or all government spending is bad. I think it is a fine bit of positive analysis, but it's also good to say, well, wait a minute, what else? So one obvious question that we could ask at this point is, What is government spending on? So if it is the case that government expenditures are rising, but it's spending on capital like goods, like roads, bridges, other kinds of infrastructure, spending on human capital or research and development that increases productivity, then even if that kind of spending crowds out private sector investment, it could still be something that correlates with an expansion in our productive capacity. So a broader question is to say, okay, I can see the sense in which crowding out could occur, but can it be the case that government spending can itself contribute to long run improvements in our standards of living? And then this then takes us to these big, deep philosophical questions of what is the proper balance between public and private spending. We don't have the time or the place to deal with that right now, but it is stuff that I hope that this provides an incentive or encourages you to think about. In a similar sort of vein, what I want to do is again think about these really phenomenally important debates in fiscal policies. So, what kind of fiscal policy choices might a country implement that would increase the quantity of investment and then by extension the capital stock and economic growth? Well, if we saw over here that let's see if I can get us back there quickly. If we saw that it was a decrease in the supply of savings that led to a reduction in investment, then policies that would increase the supply of savings would do the opposite. And we can also see that if the demand curve shifts out to the right, if there is a higher demand for investment, then the equilibrium level of investment would also be higher. So we can say then, what are some things that governments could do that would increase the supply of savings or increase investment demand on the premise that these are both things that would increase the equilibrium level of investment in the macroeconomy? So, what might we do? Well, we might think about imposing consumption taxes as opposed to income taxes. So, consumption taxes discourage consumption, stimulate savings. We might have tax preferences for private sector savings accounts. So, you save more, you get tax credit or you get a rebate. We might have reductions in income tax rates to the extent that that would encourage additional work effort, stimulate incomes, and lead to an increase in the supply of savings. On the demand side, what kinds of things might we think about? We might think about reductions in the corporate income tax rate. That was one of the things we talked about as being a shifter of the investment relationship. We might think about reductions in capital gains taxes or dividend tax rates. So allowing firms to have higher after-tax profits. Or we might think about subsidies or other kinds of tax preferences for firms that would encourage investment, like an R&D tax credit or investment tax credits generally. So an ITC is an investment tax credit. Now, normally when I am doing this face to face and I get to this point, I'm super excited as I am right now. And I look out at the classroom and it's like Charlie Brown, wah, 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 wah. So let me ask you to think about this for a minute and say, what do you think? And what I hope that your takeaway is that, okay, fine. I see the logic for how these things might stimulate investment, but a consumption tax, we're going to tax consumption. Who does that hurt? That hurts high consumers, people in the economy that are consuming more. Who are those people? They're typically poorer. They're more disadvantaged. Tax preferences for savers. Who saves? You only save if you're not a hand to mouth consumer. So the relatively more affluent you are, the more saving you're likely to be doing. Reductions for income, for reductions in taxes for you if you're a worker. Okay, But what if you're not working? What if you're unemployed? What if you have reasons why you can't access employment for whatever reason? Again, this tends to disadvantage the already disadvantaged in our macroeconomy. Reductions in the corporate income tax rate, reductions in capital gains taxes. I can just hear Bernie Sanders screaming, no, 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 no. And I hope you can too, in the sense that what I want you to get out of this is what is so cool and fun about economics, which is these policy debates. So, what's our trade off? We can have policies that clearly could be things that stimulate investment and improve long run standards of living, but there's a trade off. And so the real trick to thinking about these kinds of very, very thorny questions is how can we thread this needle? What kinds of policies might we implement that could both stimulate investment in our standards of living as well as not disadvantage people that are already at a huge disadvantage in the macroeconomy. And we'll have some recourse to talk about that when we get into some of the stuff later on in the chapter, in the semester. And the other thing that I want to remind you of is that when we have our great darn pie example, right, we said Carol and Yvonne and George and Nadia Xavier were eating the whole pie. If we don't have full use of our maximum amount of pie, right? So suppose that we have our great darn pie. So here's potential gross domestic product, but we have our four people, here's Carol and Yvonne and George and Nadia Xavier, but we have all this pie left over that nobody's eating. That's like unemployment. It's possible then for government spending to rise and not lead to the crowding out problem that we're talking about in these notes. The crowding out problem is arising because we're considering what happens when we have full employment of resources and a bigger slice that's taken by our friend George. So these are the real meaty things that I hope that as you go through, these notes and the rest of the semester, you think about and you take as part of sort of more substantive discourse as opposed to sort of oompa looping our way through public policy debates. And so with that, we go to our participation question. And it has been a long, long, hard week. I'm exhausted. I know you're exhausted. I'm going to try and slow this down a little bit next week to try to give us a little bit of a break. I think we all need it. But here's the participation question. Friday, if you happen to be watching this on Friday, is National Candy Corn Day. I love candy corn, so the participation question is going to be about candy corn. I have to mark an answer right or wrong. You're going to see the right answer being my love of candy corn. But on the whole, I wish you all a very safe and ongoing healthy weekend, and into next week. And I sure do hope that if you do something social, you are safe and you wear your mask. Anyway, next week, foreign exchange market. Take care.